Hey, Ricochet. I'm here with my father, David Berlinski, and Paul Nelson, and they were very interested in the questions that you asked yesterday, and they want to try and answer all of them, although I don't know if we'll have time. And I think the first question, the one that was it, what was the name of our member who brought it up?
Steve Dawson?
Yeah, he wanted to know, Paul Nelson, he said, is this some, he's a crank who believes in a 6,000-year-old Earth, and it really wouldn't be appropriate to be associated
Right.
with him. There's a reason people
Right.
are afraid. And I wanted to just let him respond to that.
Let me see if I can squeeze myself in here. First of all, I don't believe in a 6,000 or a 10,000-year-old Earth. I actually don't know how old the Earth is. Professionally, in my work with my Discovery colleagues, I take their date, 4.6 billion. But in my own thinking, I don't restrict myself to the assumptions made by historical geology and cosmology. I think many of those assumptions are highly dubitable. And as I think about the world as a biologist, I see relationships that I think haven't yet been fully explored, such as the fact that the existence of life on this planet, our existence, requires a whole host of organisms that appear to be synchronically, to have synchronic relationships, by which I mean they have to be jointly present on this planet to have a functioning planet at all. That's a very important question that I wish to explore. And if it turns out that the Earth is younger than people have assumed, I want the intellectual freedom to ask that question. The great thing about this conference that people don't realize is David and I and Michael Denton and the other participants can use all the tools of evolutionary theory that we find sensible, that we find well supported, plus a whole bunch of other ideas that you could never use or find very difficult to use at a professional biological meeting. That kind of intellectual freedom is incredibly precious, and in fact, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I would want it for any of my students. I would want it for any curious human being.
What questions are you trying to answer?
What is life? Why has life appeared? Larger questions beyond that. What is? What is? What is? Why is what is? All the questions that torment and perplex human beings. There are no questions that have been excluded. But in addition to that, there are obviously a whole range of technical questions of some significance within evolutionary biology, within contemporary cosmology, that are connected as questions that have a certain kind of resonance, and we'd like to examine them. Questions of origins are immensely important. They're immensely important to us as human beings. Questions of development of life over a long course of history, whether that took place, those are interesting and important questions. There is nothing that I think at this conference or other conferences we may hold that should be excluded. And specifically, I would say that questions about the sources of intellectual authority, what documents, what written evidence we take seriously, what we would reject as frivolous, those too are important intellectual questions. You know, the enterprise of science, of doing science in the Western style, which is relatively young, is as difficult to understand as any of the phenomena it studies directly. Quantum physics studies quantum interactions, very difficult, but quantum physics itself, when one steps back and examines the discipline, it's just as strange and perplexing as anything else. Why should we ignore that? Why should we say, well, we've got a settled method. We know exactly what to do. We've got the answers. The project is almost complete. The tower, which we're going to call Babel, is almost finished. And there's nothing left. That's an absurd point of view. That's an absurd point of view. We should have at least learned from the story of the Tower of Babel.
Let me ask a question. Can you distinguish between the idea of intelligent design and the position broadly on offer here, which is there's some problem with the neo-Darwinian synthesis? Because I think that's all people think of as intelligent design when they hear that, and they don't realize there's a lot of other opinions here that are also excluded from discussion.
I think that's up. Excuse me for interrupting you, but
not at all.
I'll give you a chance later today to talk. I think that's absolutely true. Look, there are people presenting papers at this conference or presenting discussions which are devoted to defending, not attacking, but defending and completing and making more clear the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And I think that's something very important for your readers to recognize. This is not a group of people getting together in Tuscany to scarf up a lot of greasy food and attack Darwin. No, that's a wide variety of opinion. I don't want to mention any names because I don't have their right. I didn't check beforehand. But there are people who are defending something that is remotely connected to intelligent design, much more closely connected to Aristotle. Other people are developing mathematical proofs of Darwinian evolution, showing for the first time that the uniqueness and existence claims are perfectly justified. So no, intelligent design is a point in a very large pointillist picture. Just
Yeah.
one point.
I have to add to that only this observation that a meeting like this with multiple competing ideas is incredibly rich and interesting, and they, in a strange way, they kind of cross-pollinate.
Sure.
Scientific meetings can be soporific when you have uniformity of opinion. There's really, it's just people wait till their talk is over and dash out. This kind of meeting, frankly, for the professional biologists I know, if they could work up the nerve to attend, they would find incredibly rewarding.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How come they can't work up the nerve? What's going to happen?
Well, it's hard to put.
What happened to you, Paul? I mean, how
Well,
has
I've always
everyone
been-
thinks
I've
you're a
al-
young Earth creationist?
The fact is, I've been assigned that label inaccurately in some cases since I was 20 years old. It didn't stop my graduate career. It didn't stop my curiosity. Once you get past the fear of some small measure of ridicule, you go on with your intellectual life. It's much harder, I think, for professional biologists who worry about the judgment of their colleagues. As I put it, perhaps maybe too bluntly, their testicles retract into their body cavity, and they miss out on all kinds of interesting discussions from which they have nothing to fear.
Oh, I agree with that entirely, but the question that comes back again and again to my mind is we all know what it is to be dreadfully frightened of a 5 a.m. knock on the door being dragged off by the secret police. But the worst that could possibly happen to a philosopher or a biologist who participates in this discussion, not necessarily here, but in any venue,
Yeah.
is a certain sniffishness on the part of his colleagues or her colleagues. Who cares? Who cares? Let them sniff in the wind.
Well,
Why are we associated intellectually, academically, with such a timorous, sniveling, low-browed group of people?
I don't understand it. And the funny thing is, ideas are not like cooties,
No.
You evaluate them on their merits. You weigh the case pro and con. To me, what we're doing, to be perhaps somewhat bold about it, is akin to the ancient agora. It's dialectic. It's discussion. It's
All right, so
conversation.
let's talk about those ideas themselves, why they're so interesting, and why they really are worth discussing. What are the most interesting ideas, the ones that are most, prospectively most fruitful?
Well, the most interesting idea of all is if you take this standard, dogmatic, orthodox view of the universe consists of atoms in the void. That's an ancient Greek idea. Well, atoms in the void are busy with entirely purposeless designs of their own. They just move around. When they're not moving around, they occupy space or there's something between them. It is, at any rate, a view of things and of nature in which there is no such thing as intelligence or design or purpose or ends in view or teleology. Any kind of rational structure is brought entirely from the atoms as they are explaining other atoms. That is a long-standing view. It's been part of Western philosophy since the time of Democritus, since the time of the Greeks. To think that that view might not be true, that in fact nature is suffused with a kind of intelligence wherever we find it, however we discern it, that the very structure of the laws of nature that we have just elaborated over 400 years may itself be convincing reason to think something is going on we never suspected. That's an incredibly provocative idea, don't you agree?
I would say so. And from that possibility, from allowing that possibility, follow all kinds of other possibilities. And once you open the door to the potential reality of design or teleology or purpose, your view of biology changes, your view of cosmology, your view, in fact, of human nature.
All right, don't tease people on Ricochet by saying we're talking about this. Tell them what you're talking about. Tell them what the arguments for this point of view are like.
Well, here's one that we're going to hear today from
What happened?
Michael Denton. He's working on a paper, actually, that's in press, arguing that the structure of the cell, in particular of the rod photoreceptor, cannot be derived from any of its lower-level constituents. In other words, if you look at all the genes and all the proteins found in this particular cell, and they are now known definitively, the structure of the cell itself, what makes it a photoreceptor rather than a gut cell or a nerve or something else, is perfectly real but irreducible to the lower level modules, if you will. Now, if that's true, all kinds of implications follow from that. For instance, for the treatment of disease, which Michael does. He's an expert on
Eye diseases.
eye diseases. That sort of proposal is radically non-materialistic in the sense of the materialistic story would derive higher level structure from lower level entities. If Michael is right, I think it's a very, very significant thesis, and I think lots of things will follow from that. But you have to be able to make the argument. You've got to be able to make the argument.
Rick makes a very similar argument. That is, the overall argument is that if we think in terms of what we know to be an inadequate category, information, we can't really say what information is. But supposing that there is some ultimate way of making that much clearer than it is today, there are two possibilities on the table. When we talk about living systems, we mean that all of the information is encoded within DNA, within one sequence space, and that the organism is simply a reading out of the information that's encoded there. Or the opposing hypothesis that the organism is not just a reading out of its DNA sequences, but it brings to the DNA sequences profound resources of information that are necessary to read out whatever the DNA has. Now, these are two very different views. If the second view is correct, and I suspect it is correct, we need to address the scientific question: how does this four-dimensional system manage to acquire, impart, and use a very rich primary source of information so that it can interpret its own code? After all, nothing in nature behaves as a living system does. The table doesn't begin as a computer code and organize itself into a table. So these are real questions that we have to ask.
But let me identify, by the
No,
way.
let me ask you a question,
Oh, I'm
because
sorry.
I want to make sure that the people on Ricochet feel that their specific questions have been answered. And one of the specific questions is, or one of the comments that we received is, the problem is these guys just don't know much about science.
Yeah, well, how can you answer that?
Yeah,
You're right, we don't. But how about addressing
Okay.
the argument?
All right.
Oh,
I think-
let me say, I went through a rigorous graduate program in the philosophy of science and evolutionary theory. Oh, and the music has come on.
Sorry.
It's the voice of God.
I'm sorry, I simply reject that. And anyone who thinks that I don't, please contact me personally. Bring any question you have. I'll be happy to entertain it.
All right, let's wrap this up because it takes so long to upload, and we'll try and have a few more conversations like this with, in fact, with as many people who are willing to speak
Okay.
as possible. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.